IoT devices is busy penetrating our world on a daily basis at our homes, at the office, in large organizations. IoT is becoming very rapidly part of the footprint that every IT organization has to manage. My name is Johan Myburgh, and today we'll be looking at an introduction to IoT and how you can use something like Azure IoT to manage your IoT workloads and ecosystem. As I said, my name is Johan Myburgh. I'm an Azure technical trainer here with Microsoft in South Africa. I'm very passionate about what I do. I'm passionate about education and sharing knowledge and empowering our customers to achieve more. So a couple of things at a high level here. We're going to look at a high level at the overview of the IoT environment. Then we're going to look at how you can run IoT with Azure. We're going to spend some time around the reference architecture and then also look at some of the SaaS solutions that we've got in our stack. So I was fortunate enough some time ago to spend some time with one of our customers training them on IoT. It is a large shipping organization, and it was a really interesting week for me. Eventually, I asked some of the delegates from this course, so how many IoT devices do you have on one of these boats? And they said to me, well, the answer is easier to give if we tell you how many types of devices we've got on these boats. And eventually, I had to stop them. I had to say, well, I get the idea, guys. Please stop, because if I can tell you, virtually everything on these cargo ships has got some sort of a sensor or some sort of a thing attached to it that is generating data and that's synchronizing data to some central point. We are talking here about ships that can do anything from there's ships with 3,000 containers all the way to 24,000 containers on one of these ships. This is the biggest ship that we've got right now. Of these containers, 40% of them are cooled. In other words, are transporting cold goods, which has to stay within a certain temperature. So that makes for pretty complex event management if you think about it like that. But there's also a whole bunch of things. There's autonomous vehicles. There's things like the tide and clearance heights that they need to be aware of, right? And some of these things are variables that can change. Some of them are not. Now, if you think about this scenario where they might have 60, 70 different ports of call with one of these ships, if you can just imagine the compliance, the requirements around that, you can very easily and simply see that process automation is key for these guys, right? So IoT can definitely help in this play. Now let's just take a big picture approach quickly. Look at the data flow and processing. If you're new to IoT, you might ask yourself, but I don't even know any of the frameworks around this. All I know is I've got a nifty Raspberry Pi at home and I want to hook it up to something. So in IoT, we typically talk about three things. We are talking about things, right? The actual devices that generate the data. We are talking about insights. And with insights, what we're really referring to is the ability to interrogate the data, to route the data, query that data, and even aggregate the data to make some business sense of the information, right? So you'll notice that from an insights perspective, what we're really talking about is once we've got the data, how do we interact with the data, how do we store it, etc. And then lastly, we've got actions where we might be doing certain things, right? Based on the information that we've gained from insights, we might have certain actions that come out of that. Coming back to the things scenario again, I want to make it clear that these things generate data and they don't just generate little pieces of data, right? Some of them are permanently connected and permanently generate data like temperature information that it's sending through every couple of seconds. It's sending those through to the cloud with what is known as a cloud to device message, and that is a C2D message. That's cloud to device. In other words, the device on a timer or on a schedule or something like that, decides that now it's time to take a look at the temperature reading and send that temperature reading through to a centralized environment. We also have on the thing side, we've also got an edge component, which implies that we can offload some of the cloud capabilities onto our on-premises stack so that not all the data has to get sent to the cloud. Just digging a little bit deeper here on insights, you will see that routing data is a core part of IoT, right? There's so much data that to establish where this information needs to end up is a key part of these solutions. And on top of that, you might want to follow some sort of a hot path, cold path type scenario, where the hot path is storing the data typically in something like Cosmos DB, where there's some compute behind it, and you can run some queries, aggregate some of the information, etc. That's of course that's the hot path. Right, the cold path on the other side is where I want to store this information for long periods of time. So I might want to be storing this information over 5 or 6 years, and then I might want to run some machine learning over that information and see, for example, which vendor devices breaks down the most, etc. So the hot path is for making calculations immediately on all this data. The cold path is for the long-term storage and analysis of that information. And then we can also manage devices, of course, meaning that if you think of things like firmware updates, right, the ability to restart the device, to send those commands down to the device, that also comes into play here. And then last but not least, under the actions, this is essentially the outcome of what we get from the insights. So it might be that the insights provide us with information to see that the device's firmware is out of date, and then we can react to that by sending a cloud to device message, and that cloud to device message might then be a command that actually installs the update, restarts the device, or whatever the case might be. So when certain conditions are met, we want to essentially action those items, and we can do it through process flow. We can do it through something like Azure Functions. If you're not a South African, you might hear some weird cries coming over my house. It is in fact Hadidas. You can Google that. Hadida is a big bird from Africa. They do drive our calls up the yin yang. All right, so here you can also see we've got integration with line of business applications, for example, workflow processes. You might want to, once something happens, you might want to send something to a line of business application like SAP, for example. It might be a purchase order, sales order, it might be an order fulfillment or something like that. So these three aspects of IoT kind of are an essential part of any IoT solution. The thing aspect of it, right? The actual devices sending the messages, a central location where the information is aggregated and possibly further queried or whatever the case might be, and then lastly, whatever actions come out of that information that we received from insights, and that allows us to do something. Now, the next part here, I'm going to chat through what are your options inside of Azure. So, for example, if I'm already running some IoT solutions on premises, how can I move some of those solutions into the cloud? Now, there's typically three use cases that I've got here for you guys. It is a IaaS, PaaS, and a SaaS option. And what we mean by IaaS is you can literally lift and shift your virtual machines. If you've got a virtual machine on premises or in some other cloud, you can lift and shift that virtual machine, move it into Azure, and your solution can now be running in the cloud. Simple as that, right? Just take the virtual machine into the cloud. That's probably feels a little bit like cheating, but if there's already solutions running there, you can do that. Of course, on the IaaS side, if you've already got certain solutions that you are running on virtual machines on premises, it implies that you are talking with some sort of a vendor, right? You might not have built the solution, a vendor might have built the solution. And to this end, it's really, really key for you to go and scratch around in Azure to make sure that you are not reinventing the wheel by managing everything yourself. It might be that that vendor of yours has already got some solutions, maybe in the PaaS or in the SaaS space that sit inside of Azure, right? And then you don't have to worry about managing this virtual machine. The amount of management for this scenario is the same amount of management you have on premises. Of course, you're not looking after the actual physical hardware and physical infrastructure, right? But it still means that you need to patch the operating system. You need to look after that kernel and whatever other frameworks your solution might be using. And then, this is will culminate, sorry, in something like business as usual, because you will not be making any changes to your solution. You're running it on premises currently, just shifting it into the cloud. It essentially just changes your endpoints, right? That's the one option, and this is definitely a good option. It allows you to migrate your existing solutions, right? The second option here is where you can actually use Azure to build your own solution. And this is a little bit more technical and complicated and complex, to be frank. This is typically what your software and hardware vendors will be doing. They will start from scratch and build something from the ground up that slots into this entire framework that Microsoft has made available for us. All right? This implies, if you're not an ISV or a vendor of sorts, that you need to have the skills, right? So with PaaS, as we know, PaaS is more a development type scenario where you might not have to look after the hardware and the physical virtual machines, but you do need to do some configuration and manage your application and the access to that application, right? So this SaaS solution kind of works for green and brown field scenarios, where in green field, if you have to build something from the ground up and there was nothing, this is probably a good option, right? It's going to give you all the flexibility and capability that you might want, even though you might have to build some of that yourself, or hook up certain solutions with one another and do that integration, right? From a brownfield perspective, you will notice that our IoT hub has got compatibility with something like Kafka. So if you're currently using something like Kafka, you might find, but oh my word, it's we can actually flip over to the Microsoft PaaS IoT solutions without making changes to our scenario, right? So if you're currently sending devices to a Kafka endpoint, you can actually change those devices to send them to an IoT hub endpoint. It will not really make any differences to the framework and libraries that you're using to do that, the sending of those messages. And then, of course, this requires some development, technical resources, maybe folk on the data side, etc. This makes for a pretty complex POC. The last option we've got here, SaaS option, is essentially a plug and play solution that Microsoft has got available for you to essentially enable and start using today. When we are talking about SaaS solutions, of course, we are talking about shrink wrapped, off the shelf solutions. And if you think about something like Office 365 or Microsoft 365, as it's called now, then you don't certainly get to configure SharePoint under the hood for Microsoft 365, right? You essentially enable the service and we do all that management and configuration for you. Similarly, we've got a SaaS solution for IoT, IoT Central, and IoT Central will allow you to simply bring your devices, hook them up, and the SaaS solution provides all the rest of the capability built in. For example, dashboarding, routing of data, right? Querying of that data, exporting the data, etc., etc. Right? And this really makes ideal scenario for a proof of concept, And it really becomes a one-stop shop for an entire IoT solution. It's not just for POCs. You can run an enterprise IoT solution using this SaaS solution. Very little skills required, if any. I think if you'd gone through one of our um, uh, Azure IoT course labs, then you'll be able to build one of these solutions. It is very straightforward. Let's take a step back quickly and look at the core components that make up an IoT solution. Now, in Azure, of course, we've got a bunch of solutions, and I'll outline also where there's an important SDK that you might want to be using. Right. So first of all, we've got our devices, and we manage the provisioning and the aggregation of data from those devices to the cloud. Okay, we do this by means of an SDK, and we've got a device SDK in our IoT ecosystem that allows you to build solutions and systems that reside on the IoT devices or close to the IoT devices, and that allows you to formulate the message and send those messages through and connect and authenticate and everything. Right, so if you were a hardware vendor, you will typically make use of the device SDK, and you will start building some of that requirement into the actual device itself, if you've got that level of access. So this is essentially the SDK that you'll be using from a device to authenticate to the cloud and to send the metric data. Secondly, you'll see here we've got a cloud gateway, or in our case, it's called the IoT hub. Right now, it might be, if you're not using Azure, it might be something else. But what we're saying is this is the component in the cloud, in Azure at least, that is going to aggregate those data, that data. Now, I've got a couple of devices here, but the reality is this environment scales properly. And when we say properly, what we're really saying is we've got an event hub behind this, and the event hub is comparable with a Kafka a Kafka cluster, and that gives you massive scale. Essentially, what happens here is we've got a data buffer, and the data will be streaming in from the devices, and it can be stored in here for something like 7 days, after which the data is simply going to drop off. If you're not doing something with the data, after those 7 days, your data will be gone. So it's important that once the data hits the IoT hub here, or the cloud gateway as they call it, then that you action on it, right? That you do something with it. Now, you will notice that we've also got a SDK for this, but if we've got a SDK for the IoT hub, why do we need the device SDK? Well, if you think about this in the bigger scheme of things, your devices are going to be those native devices that are sending the data to the hub, right? You might want to manage those devices and not manage it from the Azure portal, right? So for you to do that, we've made a SDK available for the Azure IoT Hub, and you can go and build your own web application, for example, and it can be using this SDK to interact with the cloud gateway and to be sending certain messages to the devices, for example, etc. So you can now build your management application making use of this SDK, and it'll allow you to, in the long run, manage this entire footprint here, send messages to devices, etc. Sorry about that part. Right, so that's why we also have that SDK. It is so that you can build a backend for your IoT solution. And then, of course, we've got lots of things like UI and reporting tools. Think of things like Power BI or something like that, where you might want some sort of a GUI, right, and some sort of a portal type capability or dashboard type capability to show you some of the information aggregated across these devices. We've also got stream processing here, and stream processing, you'll notice the IoT Hub itself can route data to 4 different services inside of Azure, but stream processing can route data to 9 or 10 different services inside of Azure. So even though I can configure my IoT Hub to be sending my metrics data to Azure Blob Storage, I can also use something like stream processing to perform complex queries across my metric data. I'll give you guys an example. So my device might be sending temperature data, right? So this is a temperature telemetry that's coming through, and this, of course, is how the temperature varies, right? So we can use something like stream processing, and we can say, show me the devices where the temperature was over 30 degrees for longer than 10 minutes. So we can go and create sliding windows in the data where we can query the data over and over and say, well, we want this information. And it's not just the properties of the devices we can query here. With stream processing, we can actually query the metric data. In other words, temperature, geolocation, humidity, etc., those sort of things. And then we've got storage, and with storage, this is really just for that long-term analysis, where we will allow you to take the metric data, just store it on Azure Blob Storage, and you can run something like machine learning over that over a long period of time. And then last but not least, on the right hand side, you'll see there's the business integration, where once we've queried the data, aggregated the data, and come up with some sort of with information from the raw data, we might choose to interact with those IoT devices, choose to kick off some sort of a back-end business process, and you can think of things like logic apps here, where we might have something like workflow that executes some sort of a business process. And that is a high-level overview of the IoT solutions that we have inside of most IoT solutions. Most IoT solutions have got, of course, the IoT devices, some sort of a cloud gateway, some level of stream processing, maybe some storage, and then last but not least, business integration, and obviously also some UI and reporting and dashboarding tools. So what I'm going to do here is, let's quickly crack open a demo, shall we? So my name is Johan Myburgh, and let's quickly take a look at this scenario. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm gonna crack open a simulator here. So fortunately, we've got a little Raspberry Pi simulator that we can use in Azure. And here I'm going to go to my IoT hub, and I'm going to go find the IoT hub here, and you'll see I've got this IoT hub here called Unite. The IoT Hub is really the bread and butter of our IoT solutions inside of the cloud. And if I scroll down here a little bit, you will see that I've got some IoT devices here. And the IoT devices is going to essentially be a list of devices that can connect to this IoT Hub. And you'll see that there's a Pi simulator, and this Pi simulator will have a connection string. So I'm going to copy this connection string here, and you can just search for this Raspberry Pi simulator online and you'll find it. And there you can see I'm going to go paste that connection string. And what I do here is, if I click the start button, it is going to authenticate to that IoT hub, and it's going to start sending the telemetry data. There you can see message 3, message 4 is busy pushing this information off into the cloud. Now, if I go back to my IoT hub here, within a couple of seconds, if I click on the overview, within a couple of seconds, you're going to start seeing some action coming through here. And there you can see number of IoT devices, messages used today is still 0. But if I refresh this a little bit, within a few seconds, you'll start seeing some of that data come through here. All right, so just give it a couple of moments. In fact, if I scroll down here and I look at my metrics, I'll be able to even go and select, telemetry messages sent, and you should see within a couple of seconds there's going to be some actions there. If I specify the last 30 minutes, let's hope that there's something coming through there. Anyway, I'll get back to that. Oh, that was obviously not what I intended. Okay, so that is a very, very simple scenario here, that all we've got is we've got a Raspberry Pi simulator. We type in that device's connection string, and it'll start sending some of this telemetry data through. And you'll see, so there we go. You can see some of this telemetry data. So far, it looks like I've sent about 25. There you go, about 20, 47. There's a bit of a lag here, but you can well see that, right? So there's the telemetry messages sent. And if I add a new metric here, and I, for example, say something like total devices, it should come up with one device now, right? There's one device that's actually connected. Okay, so if you have to take a scratch a little bit deeper under the surface here, then you will see that actually what we've got is we've got a much more complicated and complex scenario that usually plays out with IoT. And what we've got here is I've still got those couple of services that I spoke about in that first slide, where I've got the IoT devices, the cloud hub, the stream processing, warm path store, the storage and the UI and the business integration side. But in certain IoT solutions, this this scenario is a lot bigger than what it was in that first slide. So you'll see that if we have to take the full picture of IoT reference architecture here, you will see that the blue items are additional services that you might actually be using and might have a requirement for in your IoT stack. So here we've also got IoT edge devices, and what IoT edge devices are going to do is going to give me the capability of creating devices and hooking them up to the edge device with some offline capabilities. So now my IoT devices don't any longer send the messages directly to the cloud. They can send the messages to the IoT edge device, and the IoT edge device can selectively push the information that it needs to into the cloud. I can also start doing some processing here on the IoT edge side so that I don't have to send all the metric data into the cloud, right? So save a little bit of bandwidth there. The second option here, the blue option, is the bulk device provisioning service. Now, this bulk device provisioning service, as you saw earlier on when I connected that Raspberry Pi device, my Raspberry Pi device connected straight to that IoT hub. No options. The connection string was for that IoT hub. Now, what if I've got IoT devices that, for example, move around? I might have something on that container ship that I mentioned earlier on, right? What about those scenarios? Well, in those cases, we can also use the bulk device provisioning service, and the bulk device provisioning service has got capabilities that will allow me to hook up my IoT device and do almost something like load balancing. So if you've got a IoT device in Sydney and you've got one in Cape Town, Cape Town, then my bulk device provisioning service will look at things like latency and location. And when my device connects, now my device doesn't connect to the cloud gateway first. It first connects to the bulk provisioning service, where the bulk provisioning service is going to tell my IoT device which hub it needs to connect to. So for example, if the container ship rolls into Cape Town Harbor, it will connect to the bulk device provisioning service, which in turn is going to connect it with a cloud gateway in Cape Town, because that's the lowest latency. So the bulk device provisioning service gives you some scalability and almost a load balancing type function for your IoT devices, where you're enrolling many devices over and over and at scale. You will see here behind the cloud gateway, we've got a data transformation component, and this really rolls down to something like Azure Functions or Even the stream processing, we can do aspects of this. But the data transformation is typically a ETL type capability that we want to format the telemetry data from the IoT hub into some sort of a format that we can work with in the bigger scheme of things with our backend data, right? So you might just use the raw data, you might want to transform that data, and for that you can use something like Azure Functions, or there's actually a couple of tools for doing that. We've already mentioned the hot and the cold path scenario. I want you to notice that the cold path is for slow batch processing over the long term, and the warm path is for fast real-time processing. A good example of this might be if we were doing work with one of these organizations that install these chargers for electric vehicles. And there's certain instances where you don't want that system on. So if this happens and if that happens, you want to remove power from the thing, otherwise it might blow up. That's not something you want to do analysis from blob storage, right? That's something you actually want to happen on the edge here at on site. But in certain cases, you might be streaming the data to the cloud, and then you will use this warm path store like Azure Cosmos DB or Azure SQL to output the data into a data store of sorts where I can do some processing. And when this will give me the ability to run some complex queries really quickly over the data and give me fast answers. So that's the warm path component there. The cold path, as I mentioned, is long-term storage of the telemetry data for some things like machine learning, etc. You will also notice that we've got a security component that sits on top of all of this. And of course, security needs to be implemented at all levels in your application, right? Now, there's various ways for us to do this. We've got some authentication components and security components on the IoT Hub. The Security Center for IoT provides you with dashboard and a secure score around your IoT stack. But even on the device side, we've got a C or a C sharp security agent that we can install on the IoT devices themselves, which will check for things like port scans, etc. Right? So it's important that you understand that security needs to touch all aspects of these solutions, right? And then we've got logging and monitoring, where we can essentially use Azure Monitor to even instrument our applications and to provide things like alerts when one of these devices stop connecting to the cloud. You want to be aware of that, and Azure Monitor can set up those alerts for you. And then last but not least, high availability. Think of things like disaster recovery. First of all, your IoT hub itself has got a regional pair. And what that means is if the region where your IoT hub is deployed in goes down, we will essentially spin up the IoT hub in the regional pair, or you can do that failover manually if you wanted to test it and do that, right? So the high availability and the disaster recovery components, some of these aspects actually have some of that baked in for us. And then we've got this is a mapping to Azure services in that reference architecture. And if we have to look at some of these services here, you'll see for the bulk device provisioning, we've got the IoT device provisioning service, or DPS. For the data transformation, we can use something like function apps. For the warm path store and for the cold path store, we can use something like Azure Blob Storage or Cosmos DB or SQL or something like that. We've got a stream processing component here that allows us to do some stream processing of the metric data. And then think of things like Power BI, where I might have some reporting on that information. Of course, we can use something like Azure AD for user management and access control to these different solutions. But further to that, behind the scenes here, we can call on things like business apps, right? So for example, when one of these IoT devices stops connecting to the cloud, we can go call a workflow, and that workflow will execute and send someone an email, maybe try to understand in the logic there what has gone wrong with the device, and if something is wrong, maybe schedule a reboot or something like that. And of course, last but not least here, we've got something like machine learning, where we will use machine learning to go and access the data in those cold paths and do that long-term analysis. All right, let's quickly take a look at the demo here. There's a couple of things I'm going to just outline here. We're going to look at message routing, we're going to look at stream analysis, and then we're going to look at time series insights. Okay, without further ado, let's start with that, right? So I'm going to go to my IoT hub. Here it is. I'm going to scroll up a little bit, and you'll see that there is an option here called message routing. So keep in mind that this IoT hub might be aggregating large amounts of data, so nothing is stopping me from essentially adding a route here and saying, well, I don't want this information in the IoT hub. I actually want the information in an event hub, in a service bus queue or topic, or on something like Azure storage, right? So that is the routing, and I can route my information so that it essentially ends up in a storage account, and I'll show you what that is going to look like if I click on my always on storage account here and just scroll down a little bit to my containers. Then you'll see here, there I've got my cold path, and inside that cold path there's some of the actual data. You can see there number 16, and it's got that long path, and here you'll see that there's the actual data, right? If I look at some of these items and edit it, then you'll see that this is essentially the queue time, the properties, right? There's the temperature and the humidity and all this information. I've just created a route for that for those items. Then we've also got the second item here called stream analytics. And with stream analytics, you'll notice that if I crack open one of these items here, this is Unite, it's a stream analytics job that I created early on, then you will see if I scroll down to inputs that it allows me to add multiple inputs. There you can see I can add a stream input from my IoT hub, and I can point it to the IoT hub, and then I can provide some outputs, right? There you can see a whole bunch of outputs. This is something that that the IoT hub cannot do natively. So you need the stream analytics job to get access to all this, these endpoints in the background here. And further to this, then you will see that you can actually go and provide a query. And in here, I'm currently, this is the default query, select star into this from that as a source. But in here, I can actually go and query that, that data to specify, route all the information to this location where the temperature is above 30, just as an example. And then last but not least, we've also got time series insights. And if I click on my time series insights here, I've got one called always on. This is going to crack open a new window here for me. And you'll see in here that I've got my time series insights to start off with. And it gives me a graphical representation of that data as it streams through the IoT hub and into whatever other services. It's going to take a couple of seconds to load here, but you'll see immediately there's some data, right? So if I go and focus on that data there from a few days ago, and I specify with my Raspberry client, let's look at humidity and let's look at temperature, and go and add that. And there you can see this is the telemetry data, right? This is that actual information that's being sent from those devices. And in here, I can actually look at this, look at these. I can overlap the data. I can drill down to my heart's content to see if I can find those patterns that make up the complex events for us from the device. So where this is equal to that for 10 minutes and it's bigger than this, all of those types of queries become available here, and you can have a graphical representation here of that information. All right, so just a quick summary, not a summary here, but information about the IoT hub itself. It generally aggregates device telemetry. It's got some built-in failover capabilities. It does support different protocols, and you'll see here that we support MQTT, AMQP, as well as HTTPS. And then it provides some lightweight routing of your data and some management of things like firmware, etc., etc. It's backed by the Azure Event Hub, and the Event Hub is essentially got binary compatibility with something like Kafka. Right, and then of course we've also got the edge, and the edge I've kind of got on the next screen here, where you'll see that we've got an edge server, either Linux or Windows. We've got our IoT devices, and now these devices are sending the telemetry data to the edge server, and the edge server can selectively send whatever it needs to into the cloud. We provide you here with offline capabilities. It will by default store this data for 2 hours. So there's actually a little Azure Event Hub built onto the edge runtime for you to leverage. Yeah, applications on this edge environment runs as containers using the Moby engine. Okay, and then the last aspect of today, IoT Central, where you'll see we've essentially got the ability to just connect our devices, keep them connected, manage the lifetime over the long periods of time, and you'll see here we've got everything in any solution. There's device connectivity, edge support, device modeling, end-to-end security. We've got roles and permissions, right? Monitoring, visualization of data, ingestion. There's templates. There's even white labeling and multi-tenancy, right? All of this rolled into IoT Central. But if you look at what IoT Central is, IoT Central, up until now, we've spoken about all these services in Azure that make up the reference architecture. Azure IoT Central replaces all of that information with a single dashboard that allows you to hook up your devices and still do all of those funky things that we spoke about, the analysis, the commands down to the devices, etc. If I can crack open a demo here quickly. So if I go for IoT Central, there we go. I've actually got a little IoT Central application running here. And I'll touch on this very, very quickly. But here you'll see there's, for example, devices, right? Or there's a dashboard. And you'll see that now you don't have to go and build all of this. All of this is integrated already, right? You can bring your devices, just plug them in. We can build out these dashboards. There you'll see things like rules, right? Where I can create a new rule and select the device template, route the information to a right location. There's some analytics here where I can go and select my logistics gateway, look at battery life, and actually group it by device ID, right? And analyze this information. There you can see, you'll see very similarities here from what we saw earlier on. But in the reference architecture, it was all different services inside of Azure, right? With IoT Central, you've got one centralized application that provides all of this capability for you without you having to write any code or something like that. And that was essentially the demo I wanted to do. And just in summary, you can bring your existing virtual machines into Azure. You can build your own solution using our PaaS offerings, or you can even just switch on the SaaS solution. And what I've done here is I've added the labs available for our IoT course for you guys here, where you can go and work at your own pace through those labs if you're really interested, and it'll outline some of these things that I showed to you today. And that brings me to the end of my of this presentation. I do hope you learned a little bit about Azure and the IoT stack inside of that. Enjoy the rest of your Azure Global Bootcamp. Thanks for listening. Chat soon.